Mill-Max. If you guys are new to the keyboard scene, which most of you are, you would know that there's a hot swap option and a soldered option for PCBs. But let's just say you got the soldered option and you want to make it hot swap, or you want to swap your switches very often. What do you do then? So, Mill-Max. Here, we have an Iron180. Yes, again. Why are we building this again? Because the Iron180 only has a soldered PCB option. So a client wanted us to Mill-Max it and he gave us permission to film. So here's what we are doing. So it's a ridiculously heavy board, as you guys already know. This is the brass bottom one. So it's super hefty. There's a Smith+Rune. There is a plate that I don't really like, but it's the brass plate.
Adds more weight because everyone knows that heavier equals better.
And this is warped, so we have to bend it back.
Wait, let me see.
Jesus, don't spin it, please. The reason why people buy soldered PCBs instead of hot swap PCBs is that it enables more layouts. You can see that there are multiple different layouts that you can choose from. 6.25U, 7U. There are a shit ton of soldered holes everywhere. We have several different Mill-Max sockets that are in stock at Mecha. The one that we'll be using is a 7305 sockets. So what's the difference between 3305?
No, we don't even talk about differences yet. Hang on, pause, shut the fuck up. My turn. What is Mill-Max? Hot swap means you literally can hot swap your switches. There comes the dilemma where what happens if you buy a keyboard that doesn't have a hot swap PCB by design and you just stubbornly want a hot swap PCB? What you do is you use a Mill-Max socket. Mill-Max is just a company in the US. They're not exactly an end-all term for everything because there are also alternatives to the Mill-Max sockets called hole tights, which people barely use anymore because they're kind of terrible. There are three main types of sockets that most people always fawn about. You have the cheap budget option, which is right here, the 0305. Then you have the, what used to be the expensive one is now the mid-range option. Literally gold-plated. The only difference probably is just how the height is, because when you solder an interconnect socket like this, right, there's a lip on top of the PCB that makes it like sit higher than usual. So your switches, right, will not sit flush against the PCB, they'll be like a little bit above it. And then there's a new version which I find too expensive for me to justify buying it and using it, which is the 3305s. Basically, that top lip of the Mill-Max socket is much shorter, which allows the switches to sit like even closer to the PCB so that, you know, they don't end up like flying out.
When the Mill-Max sockets sit into the PCB, let's just say the manufacturer designed the case in which the PCB literally floats above the case, maybe a single mm or so. This Mill-Max sockets will not fit. So if you are using a Mill-Max sockets that are longer, you would have to make sure that your case fits the Mill-Max socket. For 7305s, that's my preferred Mill-Max socket, by the way. It's much shorter, it's smaller, and so it's able to be compatible with most keyboards. The drawbacks of soldering Mill-Max sockets compared to soldering switches. With switches, it's easy. 2 posts, and when you solder it, it's just this 2. But for Mill-Max sockets, when you solder it, you notice that the Mill-Max socket is see-through. There's a hole. So if you put too much solder, the solder would go into the socket and your socket will be essentially rendered useless. So every socket that a switch fits into, you need 2 Mill-Max sockets.
Actually, rookie mistake. A lot of people end up buying Mill-Max sockets exactly the same number of switches and they realize they only have half the amount.
So buy double or even more.
They solder half the board and they're like, shit.
Buy more than you need, because if it's your first time doing Mill-Maxing, you will definitely ruin some Mill-Max sockets. The final drawback of using Mill-Max sockets, not say the final, but one of the biggest gripes, Mill-Max sockets, they need patience and they need a bloody small tip. So this is the tip that I'm using. You can see how tiny this is. This is to prevent adding too much solder, and for the solder I'm using Kester 0.4 mm, so it's tiny. It's insanely thin. Final drawback. For example, an ISO enter. You can see that this keyboard does support ISO enter. You can see that some of the sockets are kind of weird. You can see 2 holes, some are joined and whatnot. So if you see holes like this, what do you do? So typically for a new guy, you won't know what hole to solder into. Don't solder it into both holes. Take a switch, a normal ass switch, and put it into the layout that you want. Where the pins are, you solder the hole. You solder the Mill-Max. For bigger holes, like the enter key, you can see that there are, you know, stretched out holes and whatnot. Put the switch in, put the Mill-Max sockets onto the pins, and then solder it. It would hold the pins exactly where you want it. So I will be using a method called the tape today. The tape. So this is a heat-resistant tape. I'll be using it to stick the whole roll down, and I'll be soldering it row by row.
There are a few ways to do it. He'll do it one way, I'll do it a different way. The method I use is, I use
the
switches. Basically dead burner switches. Well, I call them dead. I just basically take out the stem and throw away the spring so that there's none of this compression thing, so that it sits flat. Put the sockets onto the pins into the PCB so that it aligns properly, and then just solder it through. So you know exactly where each switch is and whether it's in correct alignment. And I also always use 5-pin switches because 3 pins will misalign your Mill-Max sockets. If you're uncomfortable doing it, or you're no skill or no like experience doing it at all, don't do it because you end up wasting a lot of time. You might end up fucking up your PCB quite badly or wasting a lot of sockets. If you're not sure about any of these, you know, we do provide a Mill-Max service here at Mecha. We already provide the sockets. See, we have so many of them. If you would like your boards to be Mill-Max, come find us.
So as I said before, I'll be using heat-resistant tape. What I'll do is I'll line up all the sockets for one row, and I'll just put the tape down. Careful to not lift up any sockets by accident, and making sure all the sockets are flush. So as you can see, when all the sockets are in place, I can now solder the entire row in one go. Of course, if you want to be generous with your tape, or you want to place all the sockets at one go, you can just put all the sockets down, tape it all down, and then, you know, solder the entire board at one go. So you can see that the solder has surrounded the socket but has not went in. So the socket is empty, the solder has filled up the sides, and this is how you want it. If you added too much solder, then the solder will go in and it will ruin your socket, so you don't want that to happen.
So these are my dead switch housings. So you see the switch pins, I put the socket over the switch pin and I insert. So you see, simple. Repeat for the other switch pin. And so, then what I do is, with this, I just insert it. So you see, sockets sit nicely, perfectly aligned. So for this weird little large hole, right, because this is an ALPS compatible board, they have a different pin line out. So this pin is supposed to sit further on the top side rather than on the bottom, because MX switches, the pins are further on top. And then repeat the process, and then I solder it on. That's basically it. But before that, I'm also going to add on a few others on the corners.
So the board balances itself.
Yes. Sad, this is only 6 inches.
Okay. Okay. So the Iron180, we've built it without foam. Mill-Max it, of course. It came out really good. I really love the sound of this. It looks amazing, sounds amazing, heavy as hell. I don't know how he would carry this back, but best of luck to him.
This honestly, right, was one of my dream grail boards back in 2020. I really wanted one, but when the time came, when the group buy for this brand, I was like, shit, I don't even have money. So I didn't end up getting one, but it still is one of the sexiest boards out there.
In terms of mill-maxing, what people look at for mill-maxing is this. If you have the hot swap PCB, you have the soldered PCB, mill-max is an in-between. If you really cannot decide on whether you want one switch or the other switch, or you just don't want to go for hot swapping because hot swapping does have a limited lifespan, most hot swap sockets are rated to 100 swaps, while mill-max sockets are rated to more than 1,000. And because it sits so flush and it's soldered to the board directly without any pads, it has much less chance of ripping the pads out of your board and rendering the PCB unusable unless you know how to repair it. What I love about mill-maxing, again, is to make the keyboard hot swap. I play with my switches a lot. Regardless of whether I like a switch on the board, for example, I would still swap it out when a new switch comes out. I know it's a factual statement that sound is better on a solid board, but sometimes you just can't commit in life.
Throwback to one of like our first 3 videos, commitment issues.
Yes, commitment issues.
You can come to me to look for your relationship issues because I can help you solve all your commitment problems by giving you none of them at all, so you can mill-max your stuff too.
Come to Mecha. Yes, we charge for mill-maxing. Ask us.
So where did we get this keyboard from?
This video is sponsored by Mac!